Jr. filling in for Velshi today. We're keeping a close eye on Capitol Hill, where Senate clerks have been up all night, taking turns reading all 940 pages of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act out loud. Now, they're about to enter hour 12 of the marathon reading session, which is really a delay tactic prompted by Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. It began late last night after Republicans moved one step closer toward passing the GOP mega bill to fund Donald Trump's domestic agenda. It will make his 2017 tax cuts permanent, which will disproportionately benefit the wealthiest of Americans at the expense of social safety net programs like Medicaid and SNAP that help the most vulnerable among us. It will also give a huge boost of money and support to Homeland Security and ICE so that they can significantly ramp up their mass deportation operations. 51 of the 53 Republicans in the Senate voted to bring the bill to the floor last night, which is a key hurdle toward final passage. The two GOP holdouts were Rand Paul of Kentucky and Tom Tillis of North Carolina. Now, both of those senators have been saying for weeks that they have deep reservations about the bill. For his part, Paul has been complaining about the debt that the United States will rack up as a result of this bill. And to be fair, he kind of has a point. Overnight, the Joint Committee on Taxation estimated that the GOP mega bill will add $4.45 trillion to the national debt over the next decade. Republicans dispute that number, and they say that the bill is way cheaper and that it's not going to add that much to the national debt. But as the Washington Post points out, that's only because Senate Republicans, quote, changed the way they did the math. Basically, they're using a gimmick to pretend that the very expensive tax cuts don't cost money. Meanwhile, another key office, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, hasn't even had a chance to analyze and to report its cost estimates yet, and other concerns remain. Senator Tillis has also been warning about how devastating the bill's cuts to Medicaid will be. Previous studies predict that millions of Americans will lose health insurance as a result. Tillis also warns that the bill is going to be politically volatile for Republicans in next year's midterms. But if Republicans continue sticking together to push this through, the Senate could be on track to actually pass it by tomorrow. And that would give the House time to get it to the president's desk by their self-imposed deadline of January 4th. Joining me now is NBC News White House correspondent Vaughn Hilliard. Steve Bannon is a producer for The Rachel Maddow Show and an MSNBC political contributor. And my friend David Jolly, who is a former Republican congressman and a Democratic candidate for the governor of Florida. Good to have everyone here. Vaughn, update us. What is the mood in the White House right now? And is the president feeling confident that this is going to get through both the House and the Senate this week?
This White House, Charles, knows that this is going to be close here in the days ahead, not just to get it through that final Senate vote potentially tomorrow, but then also the House is going to have to pass the version that the Senate sends over as well. And they passed that initial version by just a 215 to 214 margin here. But last night was significant progress. So from that end, the president and this administration are in a celebratory nature, at least at this point here this weekend. Now, there is going to be a lot to extract about the inner parts of this reconciliation package, and several amendments that were committed to some of these Republican senators to be brought to the floor to be voted on potentially by tomorrow morning. Those are going to be very contentious. And so we still, even at this hour, don't have clarity as to exactly what this final bill is going to look like. At the same time, they only had 2 defections. Ultimately, they could only afford to lose 3 Republican senators, and folks like Susan Collins of Maine and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, both of those more, the senators that sometimes vocally cause a little bit more ire for this president, they ultimately voted yes to move this bill forward in this motion to proceed effort here. So right now, the bill is being read on the Senate floor, all 900 plus pages. We've still got a couple hours left of that reading until official debate on this bill actually begins.
Thank you, Vaughn. Steve, I want to talk to you for a moment about the math here, because it's not seeming to math. The Joint Committee on Taxation says that the One Big Beautiful Bill estimate is going to be around $4.45 trillion added to the federal deficit. But then you have GOP senators that are saying it's going to cost only $442 billion. I mean, these are still really, really big numbers, but this still is a big gap when you're talking about $4 trillion versus less than $500 billion. Explain to me the discrepancy in where things should actually land.
Well, the math gets a little complicated because from Senate Republicans' perspective, if you don't have to worry about paying for additional tax cuts, just so long as those tax cuts currently exist. But that's absurd. It's like saying you get a car lease and it's free if you already had a car lease. And I think most of us realize that that's ridiculous on its face. But I think it's important to realize that there are a lot of Republicans who claim to be deficit hawks. They're concerned about adding trillions upon trillions to the national debt. And this is a real test for them. Do they put their money where their mouth is? Are they prepared to go ahead and support a package that's going to add $4.5 trillion of debt over the course of the next decade or so? And I think that's a real challenge for them. I mean, do they follow through on their principles, or do they just put their principles aside in order to advance the White House agenda? It's something to keep a close eye on in the coming days, because Ron Johnson of Wisconsin and others are saying that they're serious about deficit reduction. Well, now we'll get to see whether they mean it.
And I have to ask you, you're a former Republican congressman.
Sure.
Like these are your guys, so to speak. What's going on here? Because on one hand, there's this conversation about we want to shrink how much money we're spending. We want to shrink the federal deficit. And now you're voting for this huge, big, beautiful bill that's going to add so much to an already bloated budget. How do you reconcile that? Putting aside the cuts to Medicaid, the cuts to social programs, putting that aside, just with the deficit, how do you reconcile that?
Charles, you know what I love about being a Democrat? We get to accept math and science and data and public health. And here's what I know from my experience as a Republican member of Congress. Republican math never works out. They wish away the out-year consequences of the real cost of this. The real cost of this bill is over $4 trillion. They're lying to the American people. But how did we get here? This is kind of fascinating. Look, when they first passed this, they passed this so the expiring provisions, the tax cuts, would expire in 25 when Donald Trump thought he would have left a second term. And so he was going to leave this for the next president. Well, we know what happened. Donald Trump lost. Now he gets reelected. Now he has to handle the math. And so they're going to lie to the American people. But at the end of the day, what this is about is they are going to attack health care for working families. And this is critically important because budgets are values, right? They're going to keep a 2.5% tax cut for the wealthiest Americans in this bill. They want to renew it. How do they pay for it? 40% of childbirth care in the United States is provided by Medicaid. 60% of nursing care for people in their final days on earth is provided by Medicaid. Nearly 1 in 5 Americans receive Medicaid for their health care. So I don't want to hear anything from this pro-life Republican Party that somehow we're going to attack funding for childbirth care, we're going to attack funding for end-of-life care, and we're going to cut Medicaid so that we can keep these benefits in place. Look, math is math. Be honest with the American people. Republicans are dishonest about the math because it never works. In 230 years, we've accumulated $36 trillion in debt. This is going to add more than 10%. One bill is going to add more than 10% to our national debt after 230 years.
Vaughn, looking at this from a political standpoint, you have two senators in particular, Rand Paul and Tom Tillis, who are the real holdouts in terms of moving this along and getting it to the floor. What are you hearing from the White House in terms of their reaction to that, in terms of the president's interest in putting some pressure on there from within the party to try and get them on board with his plan?
Well, we know that the president was up in the late hours of the morning here on the West Wing. And when it comes to Rand Paul specifically, it's worth noting that just hours before this vote, the president went golfing with Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, out in Virginia, alongside Eric Schmidt and Lindsey Graham, who are ardent backers of the president and this bill. But Rand Paul, in a social media post, the president last night posted, Rand Paul voted no again. What's wrong with this guy? Just a couple weeks ago, he was calling him crazy. And when you're looking at Tom Tillis, well, the president's patience seems to have run out. And I think that it is notable because last night he welcomed North Carolina Republicans to present their names effectively as primary opponents in the 2026 North Carolina GOP Senate primary to take on Tom Tillis. And he said that he would be meeting with potential primary challengers in an effort to kick Tom Tillis out of office. And now that is an important Senate seat, one that Democrats could very well win in 2026. And yet the president clearly has been keeping a very big thumb on the scale of these Republican senators like Bill Cassidy, who is also up in 2026. And Tom Tillis, though, unlike in his Pete Hegseth vote, when he kept the door open to potentially voting no in the wee hours of that vote, he ended up voting yes, though he could have been the one that would have stopped Hegseth from being ultimately named Pentagon secretary. In this situation, Tom Tillis held the line and said that the cuts to rural hospitals in North Carolina that he could not stand for. And so now it's a question of whether Tom Tillis, over the course of the next year, if the president continues to try to push back against him, will be one of those defection votes that could cause trouble for this administration moving forward, well beyond the final passage of this vote.
Steve, we talked a little bit earlier about Tillis's sort of warning around this being a costly bill for Republicans come midterms. Do you think that, can you just sort of unpack the dynamic of either a failure now or something that results in a passage of this bill and the potential, and weighing that against the potential cost that it could have for down ballot Republicans who are facing tough races when the midterm comes?
Yeah, GOP leaders in recent days have talked a lot about the fact that they believe that this is necessary for success on this bill is necessary for them to succeed